Welcome back to Epidemics and the Evolution of Medicine. This is week 2, and we're going to be studying cholera, the role of sanitation in the birth of epidemiology resulting from the cholera epidemic. As background, the period from 1400 to 1700 AD is called the Renaissance, a time when Western European history, where there was a revival in the ideas of ancient Rome and Greece. Culture, art, science, and especially for our interest, medicine flourished and were studied by aristocrats and scholars who prided themselves on their education. The newly invented printing press allowed books to be produced quickly, a revolution in information technology that resulted in ideas spreading throughout Europe like never before. Medicine remained dominated by the teachings of the church, but physicians began to learn more about the human body. They read books translated from Arabic medical texts and began to study anatomy in a scientific and systematic way. Andreas Vesalius and Leonardo da Vinci dissected human bodies and made the first anatomical drawings, initiating real understanding of the organs and systems of the human body. The church did not permit the dissection of God-fearing bodies, so it was often the bodies of criminals that were used. And in this slide you can see Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of the torso and the organs of the chest and the abdomen on the left, and his drawings of the muscles of the arm on the right, and the latter were drawings that he used to inform his sculptures. While the human body was still regarded as a creation of God and the ancient Greek view of the four humors still prevailed, true knowledge of anatomy and physiology began to develop. In 1628, William Harvey published his transformative theory that the heart acts as a muscular pump which circulates blood around the body in the blood vessels. This next slide shows how he determined that arteries carry blood from the heart to the body and veins return blood to the heart, and this is taken from one of his textbooks. Discoveries like this during the Renaissance laid the foundation for a change in thinking, leading to the view that the body is made up of specialized systems that work together, the basis of anatomy and physiology that we still use today. As understanding of the body increased, so did the development of new medicines. Building on knowledge of herbs and minerals taken from Arabic writings, Renaissance apothecaries experimented and developed drugs like quinine as a treatment for malaria derived from the bark of the quina tree. The leaves of the tobacco plant were thought to have medicinal properties. Laudanum, an opium-based painkiller, was prescribed for many disorders and remained in use up until Victorian times. However, progress was slow, and many medicines remained little more than superstitious potions. Exploration of new continents and trade between different parts of the world increased, introducing global spread of disease. This was especially rapid when none of the population had any experience with the disease. The majority of people were too poor to be treated by the very small number of trained physicians. Surgery gradually improved with techniques like tying off wounds to stop bleeding, but surgical instruments remained basic: a drill, a saw, forceps, and pliers for removing teeth. If a trained surgeon was not available, it was usually the local barber who performed operations. Against this primitive backdrop, the Industrial Revolution occurred from 1700 to 1900. This resulted in a massive change in the way people lived and in their health. Huge numbers of people moved from small villages and an agricultural lifestyle to life in towns and cities that sprang up around the factories where they worked. This resulted in people living in dirty, overcrowded conditions with poor, often absent sanitation and dirty drinking water. Many died from diseases like tuberculosis, measles, and pneumonia, infections that could spread quickly and easily in these conditions. The cholera epidemics exemplify many of the fallacies on which science and medicine were based at the time. We know now that cholera is caused by infection with the bacteria Vibrio cholerae, and that's shown on the next slide. Infection occurs by fecal-oral transmission when someone ingests food or water contaminated with the feces of someone carrying the disease. The deadly effects of the infection are the result of a potent toxin called CTX that the bacteria produce in the small intestine. CTX binds to the intestinal walls, causing the body to secrete enormous amounts of water, leading to a rapid, severe loss of fluids and body chemicals. Diarrhea due to cholera has a pale, milky appearance that resembles water in which rice has been rinsed, so-called rice water stool. A patient with cholera can lose as much as 50 quarts of fluid in a day. Without treatment, the fluid loss is so severe that patients quickly become severely dehydrated with secondary collapse of the circulation. The skin turns blue because of profound vasoconstriction trying to sustain the blood pressure, and the heart and/or the kidneys fail, usually within 12 to 24 hours. Dangerously low levels of blood sugar may occur with secondary seizures, and children are at greatest risk for this. Along with their fluid losses, people with cholera lose large amounts of important body chemicals, including potassium in their stools. Very low potassium interferes with heart and nerve function, and these are life-threatening complications. In the 1800s, when cholera caused recurrent severe epidemics, almost half of cholera victims died. Cholera has been with humans for many centuries, with reports from India as early as 1000 AD. As contact with India increased in the 1800s, the disease was spread along shipping routes by merchant traders, with a major pandemic sweeping across Europe from 1826 to 1837. 6 subsequent pandemics killed millions of people across all continents. The disease first hit Britain in 1831 and London in 1832, with subsequent major outbreaks in 1841, 1854, and 1866. It is the London epidemic that occurred in 1854 that we are going to examine in detail. London at that time was very different from the cosmopolitan metropolis that we see today. With the Industrial Revolution, there had been a dramatic increase in the population, which had tripled over the last 50 years to 2.5 million people. Unfortunately, there was no comparable increase in systems for removal of human waste. For much of the city, primitive cesspools in the basements of buildings were used to collect, quote, night soil, end quote, which was removed for a price by teams of night soil men. The accumulated sewage was carted to the nearest open farmland, where it was used as fertilizer. When the night soil men were not paid, sewage accumulated beyond the cesspool capacity, even into the streets. One can only imagine the stench which is recorded in every description of the city at that time. And this slide shows in the drawing on the left a depiction of the crowding in London during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. On the right, a woodcut shows the typical method for disposal of night soil, throwing it out the window into the street. London had an ancient drainage system dating back to the time of Henry VIII, designed to carry surface water into the Thames River. As the city's population exploded, more and more houses discharged their waste directly into this primitive sewer system. This led to a dramatic decline in the quality and safety of the water, which served as the primary water supply for all of South London. With continuous contamination of the major water supply by human waste, the stage was set for a cholera epidemic. The epidemic began in the Golden Square area, north of the Thames, with water supplied by the Broad Street pump. On August 28, 1854, a 6-month-old baby fell ill with vomiting and diarrhea. Her mother rinsed out her diapers and tossed the water into the cesspool that lay in front of the house, immediately adjacent to the pump. 4 days later, a tailor who lived just down the street became violently ill with profound diarrhea. By the time he died, less than 2 days later, hundreds of residents of the Golden Square area had been seized by the disease. Yellow flags were posted on the street to indicate that cholera had struck, and priests, curates, and doctors rushed from one house to the next, trying to bring comfort to the survivors. It was into this dramatic scene of catastrophic illness and death that John Snow began his study of the disease pattern. In 1854, the dominant theory of disease causation was the miasma theory, that illnesses like cholera were caused by a noxious form of bad air. This was certainly easy to believe, given the stench that surrounded cities during the Industrial Revolution. The germ theory of disease had not yet been developed. As a physician and a keen observer of illness, Dr. John Snow, a local London physician, developed a theory that cholera was caused by drinking water contaminated with an unknown agent that caused the disease. At that time, Death records were published every week, along with information on cause of death, parish, age, occupation, and water source. In 1849, Snow used this data to show that families in the neighborhood struck by cholera received their water from two different sources. The Southwark and Vauxhall Company, which drew water from the contaminated Central Thames, and the Lambeth Company, which drew their water from a cleaner source at Thames Ditton. He showed that the houses receiving water from Southwark and Vauxhall had a much higher incidence of cholera. He publicized this information in support of his waterborne contagion theory in an 1849 essay entitled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. Unfortunately, this received little attention. In 1854, when cholera struck the Golden Square area in London, Snow rushed to investigate. Again, using the statistics in the weekly returns of births and deaths, Snow created a detailed map of the cholera cases, and that's shown on this slide with the cases depicted as small black squares. He visited all of the homes and businesses in the area, and by interviewing the local residents, he established the pattern of the disease outbreak. Who was first in the family to fall ill? The second. When did the illness begin? Had they traveled outside the area in the days before they fell ill? Had any stranger visited the home? Was there any new or different food they had eaten? Where did they get their water? Ultimately, he identified a single common denominator for all of the victims. Each used the pump on Broad Street as their source of drinking water. He also evaluated homes in the area of the pump where no cases of cholera developed and verified that these sites, most famously a brewery where the workers drank only beer, did not use water from the pump. Finally, he investigated homes in which cholera cases occurred remote from the Broad Street pump and verified that in these cases, water from that pump had been delivered to those homes. In his own words, quote, "The result of the inquiry then is that there has been no particular outbreak or prevalence of cholera in this part of London except among the persons who were in the habit of drinking the water of the above-mentioned pump well. I had an interview with the Board of Guardians of St. James Parish on the evening of the 7th of September and represented the above circumstances to them. In consequence of what I said, the handle of the pump was removed on the following day." And this is taken from a letter that John Snow wrote to the Medical Times Gazette. In his subsequent publication of the investigation, Snow included a second map called a Voronoi diagram, which outlined the area within which all addresses were closer to the Broad Street pump by foot than to any other source of water. When this was superimposed over the original map, virtually all cases occurred within the demarcated cell. Ultimately, the index case for this cholera outbreak was found to be the baby whose mother had emptied her diapers into the cesspit under their home. The Broad Street well was only 3 feet from the cesspit, which leaked fecal bacteria into the well water. John Snow's work is regarded as the founding event of epidemiology, the science that studies the patterns, causes, and effects of disease conditions in defined populations. It is the cornerstone of public health and informs policy decisions and evidence-based practices by identifying risk factors for disease and targets for prevention. Dr. Snow's ability to reason among multiple events, from the molecular to the physiologic, from clinical observations on individual patients to data drawn from an entire population, is the essence of epidemiologic investigation. This slide just shows you the Broad Street pump, which still exists today. It would be wonderful to report that in response to Dr. Snow's work, cholera was immediately accepted to be caused by ingestion of water contaminated with feces from an infected individual, but the miasma theory still prevailed. Unfortunately, Dr. Snow died of a stroke in 1854, before the impact of his work had been realized. Ultimately, in June of 1858, an early summer heat wave produced such a severe stench from the polluted Thames River that Parliament had to be shut down. Despite this record-breaking miasmatic cloud, dubbed the Great Stink, there was no subsequent increase in disease mortality, effectively refuting the miasma theory. The outcry over the Great Stink finally forced authorities to deal with the sewage contamination of the Thames, identified more than a decade earlier by John Snow. A sewage system was developed for the city, which would carry both surface water and waste away. Over the next 6 years, a massive, complex underground system of sewers, the most elaborate sewage system in the world, was put in place. London's last great cholera outbreak occurred in 1866, and investigation of this outbreak by 3 on-the-ground epidemiologists served to completely validate John Snow's work. The outbreak occurred in the East End, and review of the cases found they were essentially all served by the East London Water Company. Residents were advised to boil their water, and this arrested the outbreak, but did not explain how the water could have been contaminated, since the new sewer system was supposed to have eliminated any potential link between waste and the water supply. However, it was found that the drainage system in the East End was one of the few that had not yet been activated. An inspection revealed that the filtering system was inadequate and that a nearby river was draining into the reservoir. Within the home of the index couple for the outbreak, the water closet was found to drain directly into that river and hence into the water supply. The results of this investigation confirmed Dr. Snow's hypothesis that cholera was caused by ingestion of water contaminated with an organism in feces from infected individuals, and certified the quality of his original investigative work. An editorial in The Lancet, still England's leading medical journal, belatedly hailed John Snow as a great public benefactor. It was not until 1883 that Robert Koch isolated Vibrio cholerae as the specific cause of cholera, and the germ theory of disease was finally accepted. The organism had been previously discovered by Pacini in 1854, but his work was ignored because of the predominant belief the disease was caused by atmospheric pollution promulgated by the miasmatists. The history of cholera symbolizes the struggle for new ideas to be accepted when they oppose the prevailing beliefs of the dominant culture, an ongoing issue in the history of medicine. And what about treatment for cholera? Dramatic changes in survival have occurred with the development of effective methods for rapid rehydration. Beginning in the early 1960s, many physicians in different countries worked independently and then collaboratively to develop a simple solution of sugar, salt, potassium, and bicarbonate that dramatically decreased mortality from severe diarrheal disease of any kind, but particularly from cholera. This oral replacement therapy, called ORT, is recommended by the World Health Organization as primary treatment for acute diarrheal disease in any age group, with intravenous fluids reserved for those who present with severe dehydration. Specific amounts for each chemical are prescribed, but a homemade equivalent can be made with 6 teaspoons of sugar and 1/2 teaspoon of salt in a liter of water. A 1/2 cup of orange juice or some mashed banana is used to provide potassium. The approximate amount of oral replacement solution required can be estimated by multiplying the patient's weight in kilograms times 75. The prompt administration of the oral rehydration fluid to replace lost fluids nearly always results in cure. In especially severe cases, intravenous fluids may be required. In areas where cholera is endemic, cholera cots have been used to assess the volume of ongoing stool losses and help to calculate the amount of replacement needed. Antibiotics, which kill the bacteria, are not part of emergency treatment for mild cases, but they can reduce the duration of diarrhea and also reduce the excretion of the bacteria, thus helping to prevent spread of the disease. Antibiotic treatment is indicated for severely dehydrated patients over 2 years of age after the patient has been rehydrated. No advantage exists to using injectable antibiotics, and no other drugs are needed. Single-dose therapy with doxycycline is now the drug of choice. The first vaccines used against cholera were developed in the late 19th century. These injected whole cell vaccines became increasingly popular until they were replaced by oral vaccines starting in the 1980s. Both oral and injectable forms are about 50 to 60% effective in the first year. Oral cholera vaccines are increasingly used as an additional tool to control outbreaks in combination with the traditional interventions to improve safe water supply, sanitation, hand washing, and other means to improve hygiene. Since licensure of the 2 established oral vaccines, over 1 million doses have been deployed in various mass oral cholera campaigns around the world. The World Health Organization recommends that current available cholera vaccines be used as complements to traditional measures where the disease is endemic and should be considered in areas at risk for outbreaks. Vaccination should not disrupt the provision of other high-priority health interventions. Reactive vaccination should be considered in view of limiting the extent of large prolonged outbreaks, provided the local infrastructure allows it. The World Health Organization has now established a revolving stockpile of 2 million oral cholera vaccine doses. Although it did not happen in time to validate John Snow's accurate perception of the cause of cholera, knowledge of science and medicine progressed rapidly during the late stages of the Industrial Revolution. Understanding of how the body functioned increased tremendously, finally dispelling ideas that had persisted from ancient Greek times. Scientific knowledge spread rapidly because scientists began to publish their work. A Dutch clockmaker, Anton van Leeuwenhoek, made one of the earliest microscopes and used this to visualize what he called, quote, animalcules. The detail the revolutionary microscopes could see allowed scientists to observe cells for the first time. Medicine made great advances, the most important being development of the germ theory of disease. Belief in contagion was a critical first step in conceptualizing a causative agent that spread from one infected individual to another. The first visualization of microorganisms occurred in 1676 by van Leeuwenhoek, using the microscope that he developed. Over the next 2 centuries, scientists and physicians slowly expanded their knowledge of microorganisms as the cause of disease. In 1700, a physician named Nicholas Audrey argued that microorganisms he called worms were responsible for smallpox and other diseases. In 1720, Richard Bradley theorized that plague and all pestilential distempers were caused by the poisonous insects, which were living creatures viewable only with the microscope. There was a major acceleration of knowledge about bacteria as the cause of disease beginning in the mid-1800s, after Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg introduced the word bacteria in 1828. Semmelweis was an obstetrician working at a Vienna General Hospital in 1847 when he noticed a dramatically higher incidence of death from post-delivery fever among women who delivered at the hospital with the help of the doctors and medical students, compared with births attended by midwives, where childbirth fever was rare. Semmelweis made the connection between the fever and examinations of delivering women by doctors, and he further realized that these physicians had often come directly from autopsies to deliveries. Asserting that childbed fever was an infectious disease and that matter from autopsies was implicated in its development, Semmelweis made doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime water before examining pregnant women, thereby reducing mortality from childbirth from 18% to 2.2% in his hospital. Despite this evidence, his theories were rejected by most of the contemporary medical establishment. In 1859, Louis Pasteur, an important advocate of the germ theory, demonstrated that the growth of microorganisms causes the fermentation process and that this growth is not due to spontaneous generation. This was the first of many important observations that he made about bacteria as the cause of disease. Some of his work was in conjunction with Robert Koch, who first identified the bacterium that causes anthrax in 1875. Pasteur then developed the first effective vaccine for anthrax in 1881. Koch's experiments not only helped create an understanding of anthrax, but also helped elucidate the role of bacteria in causing illness at a time when debates still took place over spontaneous generation versus germ theory. Koch went on to identify the bacillus that causes TB in 1882 and the bacteria that causes the plague in 1883. In his research into tuberculosis, Koch finally proved the germ theory, for which he received a Nobel Prize in 1905. In Koch's postulates, he set out criteria to evaluate whether an organism is the cause of a disease, and these are still in use today. The first is that the microorganism must be present in all cases of the disease. Second, the pathogen must be able to be isolated from the disease host and grown in pure culture. The pathogen from the culture can then cause disease when inoculated into a healthy lab animal, and the pathogen must be re-isolated from the new host and shown to be the same as the originally inoculated pathogen. By the late 19th century, it was well established that bacteria cause disease. However, no specific antibacterial agents were developed until Ehrlich developed the first antibiotic to treat syphilis in 1908. While the germ theory was developing, knowledge about the importance of hygiene and sanitation also progressed. Perhaps the most famous nurse ever, Florence Nightingale, worked in a military hospital during the Crimean War. Conditions were poor, and 80% of soldiers died from infections they caught in the hospital rather than from their original wounds. Nightingale improved standards of hygiene and sanitation, which dramatically reduced the infection rate in her hospital. When she returned from the war, Nightingale embarked on a campaign to modernize and improve hospitals by instituting universal standards of hygiene and sanitation. In the 1870s, Joseph Lister was instrumental in developing practical applications of the germ theory of disease with respect to sanitation and aseptic surgical techniques. He realized that infections caught during an operation often led to death by infection afterwards. He pioneered the use of carbolic acid as the first antiseptic to clean wounds and surgical instruments. Operations were performed with a fine spray of carbolic acid passed over the operative field to kill microbes in the air. In one Newcastle hospital, use of Lister's antiseptic technique reduced deaths from infection from nearly 60% down to just 4%. What is the current epidemiology of cholera? Cholera was as prevalent in the United States in the 1800s as it was anywhere else in the world, before effective water and sewage treatment systems eliminated its spread. In industrialized countries, modern sewage and water treatment have virtually eliminated cholera. The last major outbreak in the United States occurred in 1911. Only about 10 cases of cholera are reported each year in the United States, and half of these are acquired abroad. But cholera is still present in Africa, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and South America. The risk is highest when poverty, war, or natural disasters force people to live in crowded conditions without adequate sanitation. According to the World Health Organization, cholera affects 3 to 5 million people worldwide and causes between 100,000 and 130,000 deaths every year. A stunning example of the continuing power of cholera to cause epidemic disease with major loss of life is currently ongoing in Haiti. On January 12, 2010, a devastating earthquake with a magnitude of 7 struck Haiti, killing more than 160,000 and displacing close to 1.5 million people. In the early stages of recovery, in mid-October of 2010, a cholera outbreak began in the rural Center Department of Haiti, about 60 miles north of the capital. By the first 10 weeks of the epidemic, cholera had spread to all of Haiti's 10 provinces. Haiti had had no cholera case in more than 100 years, so this epidemic triggered panic and confusion in the populace. The spread was partially blamed on the poor distribution of health supplies due to logistical problems. The Pan American Health Organization said there was also a lack of access to untainted drinking water. As previous epidemics have shown, cholera spreads rapidly when water and sewage treatment is inadequate, and this was the situation in Haiti after the earthquake. The suspected source for the epidemic was the Artibonite River, from which most of the affected people had drawn their water. Suspicion among Haitians centered on a UN military base on a tributary of that river, which was home to peacekeepers from Nepal. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said its tests of DNA fingerprinting showed cholera samples from the Haitian patients were identified as a subtype found in South Asia. A study conducted by French epidemiologists revealed that UN troops from Nepal had started the epidemic when waste from outhouses at their base flowed into and contaminated the Artibonite River. A separate study, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, presented DNA sequence data for the Haitian cholera isolate, finding that it was most closely related to a cholera strain found in Bangladesh in 2002 and 2008. The authors reported, quote, "The Haitian epidemic is probably the result of the introduction through human activity of a Vibrio cholera strain from a distant geographic source." The UN has been reluctant to address whether its peacekeepers brought the deadly strain of cholera to Haiti, focusing on helping the country to address the epidemic. However, by many measures, Haiti is even less equipped to tackle cholera now than it was 3 years ago. The UN raised barely a fourth of the money it needed last year to provide life-saving supplies, including the most basic, like water purification tablets. Clinics have run short of the critical oral rehydration solution. Some treatment centers in the countryside have shut down, as aid groups that ran them have moved on. A rising percentage of cholera patients die in the treatment facilities that remain, reflecting the inability of health centers to provide adequate health services to cholera patients and the longer travel time required for treatment as a result of the closure of the treatment centers. The UN has yet to raise the funding necessary to vaccinate 600,000 vulnerable people. Haiti's own healthcare system remains in shambles, with clean drinking water and sanitation as scarce as when the epidemic began. Less than 2/3 of the population has access to clean drinking water. According to the UN Humanitarian Office's latest country report, published at the end of 2013, the main cause for the persistence of cholera in Haiti is the lack of access to clean water and sanitation facilities and poor hygienic practices. Since the outbreak in October 2010, there have been over 700,000 cases of cholera and at least 9,000 deaths. More than 6% of the Haitian population have had the disease. And this is just shown here on the next slide with the total cases and the death toll, dating from 2010 to 2014. Meanwhile, a study reported in the New England Journal of Medicine in May of 2014 documented that one of the 2 oral cholera vaccines conferred 86% protection in a cholera outbreak in Guinea, Africa, evidence that vaccinating against cholera should be part of the primary response to a cholera outbreak. Despite all the progress that has been made since John Snow first identified its epidemiology, despite all that we know about prevention and treatment, cholera remains a deadly disease.